Thank you very much, Toby. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. It is truly a great honor for me to be speaking to you today, and a truly daunting responsibility, because I don't know how much you know about the Holocaust and about the survivors who are still walking amongst us. What I do know is that at some point, inevitably, they will cross paths with you when old age and illness will require assistance. And I have to admit, Toby, this last bit that you said kind of threw me into a different state for a minute, so it takes me a while to get back to it. I hope that when they cross paths with you and they need your help, that each of you will do their best to end their lives, to offer them the care that they need at the end of their life, possibly the last interaction that they will have with their fellow human beings. I hope that all of you will do your best to give them as compassionate care as you can, unlike what my beloved mother got. And that it will be as humane and free of suffering as it can be, because they suffered greatly. Just give me a moment. Okay, so let me just get started with a short review of some of the points that we also included in your file, just to provide a very minimal historical context for the issues that we're going to be discussing. World War II was a global military conflict, the biggest, we hope, the last of its kind so far. It involved most of the nations, and they formed eventually two big groups, two big alliances. The Allies, led by the British and Canada and France, and eventually others. Thank you very much, Miriam. And the Axis, led by Germany, Italy, Japan, and others. The Jewish Holocaust, the Shoah in Hebrew, was, like Toby said before, I think, the systematic plan to annihilate all Jewish communities and literally physically exterminate all individuals of Jewish descent. It was referred to by the Nazi leadership in the euphemism, the final solution to the Jewish question. After the invasion of Poland, which is what started World War II in September 1939, previously begun anti-Jewish policies and legal steps were escalated to imprisonment and murder of Jewish people, Polish Jewish people, Western European Jewish people, and Jews of the Balkan countries. The prisoners from very far away, from anywhere in those areas, were transported to concentration camps in cattle cars. Sometimes, like Judith spoke of the marches that lasted 17 days or 12 days, these train rides in cattle cars, cramped to the point that nobody could sit. There was no room to move, there was no room to breathe, not to speak about relieving oneself, not to speak about getting food or water. These train rides were such that many individuals did not make it and died on the way. I would like to show you a small excerpt from an Israeli documentary called Because of That War. It's the VCR we're going to use first. Just This is a documentary, as I say, by two Israeli musicians, my age, second generation. One is the one whose parents will be talking here, Yuda Poliker from Greece.
Power.
Okay, power, play, VCR. No, he said
והכניסו אותנו בחלונות והם סגרו את הדלתות ולא היה גם אוויר, זה היה סגור, היה חלון קטן, זה קרונות. הכניסו אותנו בחלונות והם סגרו את הדלתות ולא היה גם אוויר, זה היה סגור, היה חלון קטן, זה קרונות של מביאים סוסים ופרות, לא קרונות כאלה שמביאים סחורה, פרות. לקחו אותנו ו14 יום עשינו, הוא עמד בבולגריה, הוא החליף מכונה, הוא עבר, הוא עצר, הם היו עושים בכוונה סיבובים, הרכבת כדי שאנחנו נחלט בפנים, שאנחנו נמות, שככה עשה, היו עומדים כמה פה, היו עומדים שם.
אתה היית עם הילד?
אני הייתי בפנים עם האישה ועם הילד בת שנתיים פה. הילד שלי כבר היה ככה, לא היה, הוא ביקש מים, לא רק הילד שלי, כולם בפנים, לא היה מים. הכניסו אותנו איזה פחים מים שכבר זה היה חלודה ולא היה שווה. זה היה נגמר, נשארנו בלי מים, עברו עם חלודה, שתינו את הכל, נשארו הפחים ריקים, ובסוף לא היה מים. והילד שלי ביקש מים, היה כבר עם הלשון בחוץ, כולם, ואנשים מתו בתוכו, ושלא היה להם מים, לא היה מזון, לא היה אוכל, כולם. והילד שלי היה מוזומן כזה, ואשתי, ואבא של אשתי, וגיסתי, והאחים, וכולם ביחד נסענו, כולם. ואבא שלי לא מסכן, הם סחפו אותו כמו כלב, והכניסו אותו ברכבה, בתוך הקרונות, בתוך הרכבת, ואת האמא, ופניקה, ובכי, וצעקות, ואל תשאל, אי אפשר, זה נורא נורא עצוב מה שהגרמנים עשו לנו, זה נורא שאין כמו זה. עובדה שאני 50 איש אני נשארתי לבד, הנה. שם קיבלתי בבירגנאו, קיבלתי את המספר.
הגיעו הגרמנים, הם באו בריקשות, קפצו מהריקשות, סגרו את הרחוב, ואנחנו...
As I said, the Nazis built concentration camps where inmates did forced labor under extremely inhumane conditions and suffering very cruel, sadistic treatment. Some concentration camps were extermination camps where newly arrived were immediately killed. In its entirety, the final solution called for the murder of all European Jews by gassing, shooting, all other means. Approximately 6 million of Jewish men, women, and children were killed during the Holocaust. They consisted of 2/3 of the Jews that had lived in Europe before the war. Could you show the next slide, please? No, slide 4. Oh, we need to move to the other.
So that's okay.
Okay, so we said this, and then we go to import 1. Okay, next slide. Amongst the 6 millions are these people, the Felsen family, my father's family. 2 of his sisters, other sisters, are not in the picture. They're the ones that managed to leave Poland for Austria before the war. There is no picture of my mother's family. She was one of 7 children. She's the only survivor of her entire family. Survivors of the Holocaust are defined as all people who lived under Nazi-occupied territories during the time between 1933 and 1945. They therefore have been uprooted. They could have been in labor camp, concentration camps, extermination camps. They could have been in hiding, living under false identity. They could have been in the woods. They could have been hiding in a cave dug under the ground. They could have been alone or with others. They could have been on the run. And depending on where they were, they could have spent anything between 1 and 6 years under Nazi persecution. They all experience hardships and brutalities that are described and documented, but are otherwise inconceivable. Depending upon where they were, circumstances were different, but all of them were terrible beyond our comprehension. I have heard hundreds of testimonies by now, and each and every one of them is inconceivable. I would like to speak with you a little bit about the effects of trauma, the long-lasting effects of trauma, and for that I would like to just briefly, could you go to the next slide, speak about PTSD and its clusters. We will skip over this testimony just to make sure that we have enough time. I do recommend, if you're interested, I'll give you the link. It's one of the testimonies that we recorded at the Yale Archives of Video Testimonies. Go to the next one, Paul, please. Okay, so no, I didn't make a slide for it. So let me just go over it. Before we talk about the effects of trauma, I'm sure many of you are very well familiar with the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, but let me just review it quickly with you. There are really three clusters that are most important. The first one including the re-experiencing part of it, which has to do with the unbidden remembering, the intrusive remembering at unpredictable times of very traumatic memories. So for example, I will use the same person so I don't have to give you background each time. For example, Anita is a Holocaust survivor. She grew up in a very well-off, warm family in Germany. Her father was a director of bank. Her mother was a musician. And she learned after the war that her parents did not survive. She learned after the war that her mother was one of the victims of the hypothermia experiments. And she told me about, for example, when she goes to the park and she hears a beautiful concert and it's a beautiful day and the children are playing and she's trying to have a wonderful time, and she said, all of a sudden I see a picture of my mother playing the violin and it's all destroyed for me. My entire mood is changed and it's all terrible at that point. And at 87, just like you, Judith, when she speaks of it, she wells up as if it just happened. It is as fresh as if it just happened. Of course, we all are aware of flashbacks, which are really reenacted memories that occur, and the nighttime during sleep there are nightmares. These are some of the elements of re-experiencing. Of course, when people have these unbidden memories that come up in the context of everyday life, and they can be reactions to anything. I remember my father once, I was driving, and something reminded him of Stachelbeeren. You know, it's a particular kind of berry in Germany. I was working for the Israeli government in Germany, and he came to visit me, and he said, I said something, Stachelbeeren, and I heard him say to my mother something pretty awful. He thought I didn't hear him, some horrible memory about Stachelbeeren. And there's a very beautiful moment of this nature in the movie Fugitive Pieces, if anybody happened to see it, where the child is eating an apple. Child of survivors is eating an apple, and at some point he gets distracted and he had enough of the apple, so he leaves half an apple, half eaten, and he wants to get off the sofa and go do whatever he wanted to do. He was sitting on the sofa, his father was hugging him, The mood was very affectionate and calm and good, and at that moment, as he leaves the apple uneaten, his father goes into a rage. And it's terrible, and it's very scary, and you see the child frozen in fear, and you understand as the episode develops that for his father, the fact that his son can treat food so recklessly, take a couple of bites and throw the apple, is a horrific thing. Now, of course, in terms of us who have not been in these situations, whether we are the children, whether we are other people treating the survivors, the reactions can be so disproportionate, so irrational, and so horrible that it's easy to think that something is really very wrong with that person dispositionally, in terms of the personality, if we don't recognize it as part of the lasting impact of trauma. The other cluster of PTSD that we speak about are avoidance and numbing, which come sort of together often in the discussion. Avoidance has to do with avoiding people, situations, things that might give rise to such triggering experiences. However, it's a very problematic defense because, first of all, one really cannot avoid the triggers. If the triggers can be anything, then the triggers can be anything. What it does do is definitely it impairs people's functioning because it constricts them. It makes them not do all kinds of things, not go to all kinds of places, and not collect what could be new positive experiences, which would be healing in and of themselves. So that's a cluster that is particularly important for us as people treating people with traumatic experiences in their past, because that's the part that impairs functioning and detracts from life after trauma the most. I have done a study in Israel about the survivors that were the most damaged, the chronically hospitalized survivors that were in hospitals for 40 years. And I will not go into that because there's an unending amount of stuff we want to get through today, but we can see even with these people that once you address in a different way the post-traumatic stuff, the trauma, and you address it in a certain way, there was a reduction in avoidance behavior after 40 years in these chronic patients, not to mention in other people. And that's the element that allows people to then, all of a sudden, after 10 years when they never left the unit, to go on a day trip outside into the community, to do some things which then allow them to establish a different relationship, perhaps with staff members, perhaps even with family members that come to visit, and so forth. The numbing is something that has to do not just with behaviors of withdrawal, but rather with the emotional constriction that comes along it. The attempt is to sort of control the arousal, the emotional involvement, the vulnerability to these memories, to the feelings that come up in one, by not being too open to intimate relationships, to meaningful experiences. And it can be part of the defense, and it can also be a result of the third cluster, the cluster that we call hyperarousal, that has to do with a chronic state of hyperarousal, physiological hyperarousal. And if you are in that chronic state all the time, it depletes the system. So there's not much energy left for engaging in a very patient and really focused way in relationships and with things. Think about yourself. Think about yourself when you were a parent to a small baby. After 3 nights of poor sleep, when the baby had teeth pains or something, think how patient you were to be engaging very patiently with somebody else. So we talk about the hyperarousal. It includes a lot of behaviors that, again, in and of themselves are problematic in terms of relationships: the disquiet, the inability to relax, the startle reactions, hypervigilance. Everything is constantly being scanned for danger, scanned for problems, to the point that we, who are with the person, whether a patient or a parent, are feeling uncomfortable. We want them to stop that behavior. We want to be able to give them a different experience, a better experience, and we can't talk sense into them. We can't convince them to stop it. It's very frustrating. It adds to the problematics in relationships, which we will talk about in a minute. So these are the clusters of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not the only pathology, if you like, that psychopathology that follows traumatic experiences. Over the recent years, we have an enormous amount of empirical evidence that demonstrates that two things. First of all, that there is a great variability in the individual response to trauma. That is, we cannot know who will respond with what degree of problems following a traumatic experience. Some people will go through terrible things and will come out with relatively few symptoms. Some people will go through relatively minor things and develop significant and impairing symptoms. So that's a tremendous amount of individual, of inter-individual variability. However, despite that point, we also do see in studies that look at any kind of traumatized population, whether it's war veterans, prisoners of war, war veterans from different wars, from different arenas, victims of crime, victims of rape, what we do see is that there's no doubt a very strong association between exposure to trauma and psychological problems, psychiatric symptoms following that exposure. The exposure, as I said, can be related not just with post-traumatic stress disorder. It can very much be related with other things such as depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse, which is maybe utilized in order to control some of these emotions and some of these intrusive memories, panic disorders, and we do see a certain association or correlation that suggests that the more traumatic or the more significant the exposure was, the greater the likelihood of suffering from depression and other disorders later in life at some point. One other thing to mention, again, related to the point that I made before about avoidance, when depression comes together with post-traumatic disorder, which is often the case when it's comorbid, then it's much, much harder to treat the depression. And therefore, it's so important for us as mental health professionals to be aware of the individual's history, because often what you will see is more easily the depression. People not necessarily meet full criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and certainly many of them don't have the hallmark cluster, the one of re-experiencing traumatic memories. So you get the avoidance that looks a little bit like the behavior of a depressed individual, also the withdrawal, you get the depression, and you think, depression. And then you try to treat it and it's unbelievably unmovable and doesn't change and doesn't respond, because one has to address the trauma element before we can really move something about the depression. Again, it's related also to that feedback loop. If you don't address the avoidance, if you don't address the reasons for the avoidance that go back to the fear of traumatic memories, you don't allow the person to improve functioning and to move, to mobilize towards some better, positive new experiences. The prevalence of chronic, not acute, chronic post-traumatic stress disorders in war prisoners of different, Vietnam, World War II, no matter what, ranges in the literature between 47 and 54%. That's high. That's a very high number of people suffering. The percentages for Holocaust survivors range between 51 and 90. And I'm not talking full criteria, I'm talking a significant amount of symptomatology, and that does not mean that these very same individuals did not manage to build families and successful lives and accomplish a lot of things, but at the same time they did that while still suffering for 40, 50, 60 years from significant post-traumatic symptoms. Okay, I would like to speak a little bit with you about specifically trauma and aging. So over the last decades, it has become clear that traumatic experiences that are either short and shocking or long durations of stress can cause serious, lasting health problems of a variety of shapes and forms. Even if the traumatic event was relatively short in the lifespan of the individual relative to the other 50 years lived afterwards, it was shown by many studies that looked at that. For example, a lot of studies in Israel looking at Holocaust survivors, a lot of studies here, but also by now gradually an accumulation of studies about Vietnam vets. And even in young Israel, there is by now an accumulation of studies about the POWs of the wars of Israel. Evidence suggests that even short periods are related to premature aging and a much poorer adaptation to aging among these individuals. There is not just an exacerbation of PTSD in those who had some. There is even sometimes the late onset of PTSD in individuals that seem symptom-free for many years. There is, of course, also a very high appearance of depression and of anxiety disorders along the lines of what I said before, but in very high percentages among people with these types of traumatic experience in the past. Again, the individual reactions to those experiences are not only different from one person to another. Like I said before, there's a great variability. You know, some people were I treat a lot of people who were or are related to victims of September 11th, people who were in the trade center or buildings or relatives. Some people were there and have relatively few symptoms. Some people who are actually not even related directly but watched what happened on the news have significant symptoms. It's not, again, that's a measure of the difference in the variability amongst individuals. With regards to the relevance to aging, what we also see is that there's a great variability in the course of post-traumatic symptomatology along the individual's lifespan. Some people have it immediately and acutely after the traumatic event, and then they spontaneously recover. They will be counted in our epidemiological studies of lifetime occurrence of PTSD, but they will not necessarily show much symptoms when they're 50, 40 years later. Some individuals will go symptom-free for a while and then show exacerbated symptoms. These are the people that I think we're talking about now. Holocaust survivors have managed, for the most part, to rebuild their lives in the United States as well as in Israel with very little assistance from the mental health systems. They were not, they did not approach these systems if they only had a choice. Very few of them, only those that really collapsed, came to the attention of the health system, and the health system did not really do much for them. Now, as they age, and this is something that I think Dasberg in Israel, Holocaust survivors who are psychiatrists themselves started pointing to that phenomenon about 20 years ago, that Holocaust survivors who are aging, who are nearing sort of 60 at the time, 65, were beginning to show difficulties that they didn't experience before and were beginning to come to talk to mental health professionals. There are several reasons, I think, that may be the case, and that the resolution of trauma and the capacity to adaptively change as one ages, they share certain mechanisms, they share certain tasks, they share challenges in ways that can become very complicated and can sort of make the resolution of both more difficult. Let's think about some of the things that were in one of the articles that I think are in your folders. You know, we all, from a lifespan perspective, much related to Erikson's life stages model, we know that every life stage is kind of focused around particular tasks, and we know that the task of the late phase in life is to achieve what he called ego integration, as opposed to when you don't achieve it, and the other side of the unsuccessful resolution is despair. We know that in the process of doing that, the mechanism that seems to be very typical for people is around age somewhere, I don't know, between 55 and whatever, we start reviewing things. We start reviewing what we did, we start reviewing if we did well enough, what we still want to do, what we still can change, what we cannot change anymore, did we live up to our potential, and all that. In that life review, there are many things that can become very complicated for trauma victims. First of all, life review brings up all of those memories, thoughts, and feelings that they tried to somehow suppress for many, many years, and that they were so busy while raising their children, while building a life in a new country, that they maybe managed to do so. Maybe being very, very busy, doing all of these things that they did, which indeed is unbelievable. Think about it. Think about finding yourself in a different country, with a different language and a different culture, with often incredible holes in your education, and managing to build yourself into a state of relative socioeconomic viability, building a family, raising children, all of those things. It's daunting, it's admirable, it demands a lot of time and energy, and it helps to push certain things aside. I know, for example, for myself, right after my mother's death, the worst times for me were those 20-minute car rides between things when I couldn't be terribly busy. That's when the worst thoughts and memories and images came to haunt me. So thinking about what was goes against that defense. It brings back very painful memories, not only of the traumatic times and the horrible things that one suffered. Also, another thing, because people's lives were interrupted. People's lives, like Judith, like my patient Anita, who came from sometimes very good families, had certain prospects of doing certain things, becoming certain things. All of that was interrupted. All of that was thrown into total impossibility. And from that they came out, and with that they had to now work. With that they had to now build a new life. And what happened is that often those lives, as incredibly successful as they may be when we take into account what these people went through, were very different from the lives these people had imagined they would have. They may have thought that they would go to university and they never got to finish high school. They may have thought that they would marry for love and they ended up marrying someone because it was the person that was there and there was nobody else, and they wanted to connect with somebody as soon as possible and not be alone in the world. They may have thought that they would have children and they can't because of what happened to them. They may have had all kinds of things that didn't turn out to be, and with that, they also have to contend. These are the losses that are not perhaps the core traumatic memories that come to haunt them, but these are nonetheless losses related to that traumatic interruption of life. The other thing is, with regards to painful memories, I would like to throw in another little point, and that is that people who don't understand trauma sometimes make very understandable mistakes, but mistakes that make the trauma victim realize that they cannot be helped by this person. For example, my patient Anita, when she had to be hospitalized because of a severe physical condition, met a rabbi in the hospital where she was. He came to visit her, and the rabbi was a young man, and the rabbi said to her, when she told him, she said, "I feel so horrible. I can't stop thinking about my mother. I can't stop thinking about the terrible, terrible end of my mother. What this wonderful woman felt when this was her end, when people were doing this terrible thing to her and causing this terrible suffering and not helping her, and that's how she died." And he said to her, "You know, you just need to try and forget about it." And she felt like the world collapsed on her. When she came out of the hospital and she came back to me, she was so shocked and so shattered. She said, "How could the rabbi say to me, you should just forget about it?" And I think that in this case, I would tell you that one of my initial mentors in Israel, Professor Hillel Klein, who was a psychiatrist and a survivor himself, said, "You have to understand that sometimes the memory is all we have." For my mother, like you, there were no photographs left at all of my mother's family, and she was very close with her mother and loved her very much. And while she has a lot of memories of things that she did with her mother and how her mother did this or that, my mother could not imagine her mother's face in her consciousness, only in sleep. She could only see her in sleep, but when she wanted to think about her face, she couldn't remember her face. Think about it, when there are no grave sites, when there are no objects to hold on to, like I saw in Hamburg with many German families. This is the cup that my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather brought from Russia in his trip on, in February 1860. You know, we don't have any objects, we don't have photographs. Sometimes all one has is the memory, and as painful as that memory is, to say forget about it is to say erase that person, erase that relationship. So while we would like to make our lives easier and say just stop thinking about it, we have to understand what does it mean for trauma survivors to be haunted and yet comforted both by very painful memories of the people that they loved, when it's so complicated because you love the person, and as you're trying to remember this loved person, you're also remembering the horrific way in which they died and what they might have suffered before they died. So all of these things have to do with some of the issues that complicate the resolution of trauma, because in order to resolve trauma, we somehow have to be able to get through this, to get to some kind of a desensitization, normalization of our grief, and come from complicated, overwhelming grief to what we consider normative grieving, and then to be able to experience the good and the bad memories that we have and sort of move on and make the traumatic memories become memories. When the traumatic memories cannot be resolved, they really do not ever become memories. They are really live, encapsulated experiences that can be triggered at any time, as we said before. And that makes life very difficult for trauma survivors when they age, as the aging process supports and encourages these processes. Let me see, how are we doing with time? I have to put my watch in front of me because...
We have another 10 minutes. Perfect.
Oh,
15?
My
15.
God. Right. Okay. All right, let us skip here. Okay, let me then decide what it is that I would like to focus on and show you. Okay, if you can, while I speak, if you can go back to where we, forget it, Paul, we'll give up that piece. I do recommend to you very much, if you would like to hear to see this movie because of that war, there is a very moving inclusion there of the music that one of these musicians creates, and I think it's wonderful. I wanted to show you how he incorporated his father's pain and his father's Greek, very painful songs into his music that he creates. But we'll just go over that. We'll go quickly to the long-term effects on relationships, because this is some of the stuff that you deal with when you see these people and their adult children now. Children of Holocaust survivors are often profoundly identified with their parents' pain and losses. They feel very responsible to protect their parents from further suffering, and they express it. If you look at studies of children of survivors, it's something that they express from very early on. Some people call it parentification, some people call it a certain reversal of roles. It's certainly a very profound motivation in the lives of children of survivors. So when children of survivors are watching their parents become very ill and suffer, and when they have to relinquish control over their parents to strangers who are not always perceived as very caring, it is a tremendously painful, difficult, traumatic experience also for the children of survivors. And I say traumatic, meaning it very much so, because we also see very clear secondary traumatization in the second generation. There is transmission of trauma, of Holocaust trauma, to the second generation, and it becomes a very important part of the psychological lives of the children themselves, although they were not born when the events happened. So when here you see a parent suffering and someone not responding to their suffering, being a little careless, being cruel, being insensitive, it is truly traumatic to the child of survivors also. A very beautiful book that I also could recommend to you is A Thread of Grace, is the way it was in Hebrew, by Maria Doria Russell, about survivors hiding in the mountains in Italy, northern Italy. Beautiful, beautiful book. And at the very end of the book, after we have come to know these people so well when they were young and what happened to them and this and that, there is an end chapter where we learn that this woman dies in a hospice in Canada, and the rabbi meets her and her children, and the rabbi gets to see how these children of the woman view her as such a difficult woman, such a closed-off woman. They don't have any access to these parts that we have become so fond of during the entire book. That can also be your experience. You can also have children of victims or survivors of trauma that have experienced their parents as impossibly difficult growing up, as intrusive, explosive, or, on the other hand, closed off, remote, uninterested, not affectionate, because of the effects, the long-term effects of trauma on these parents. And therefore, when you see these children behave in ways that are very difficult to understand, you know, I have a patient who's a nice woman. She's a nice woman. But when her mother was in the hospital, in Brooklyn, mind you, and the woman lives in New Jersey, she barely went to visit her. It was so difficult for her to be with her mother alone. She only goes there twice a year, and only with her husband and her children to visit her in Brooklyn. All of a sudden it was in the hospital. She needed to go. She couldn't bring herself to go. It's very hard not to judge. It's very hard not to feel superior. It's very hard for us as the mental health professional not to try and be the better child. You shouldn't. It's not serving any of them at all well if you do. We have to try and understand what happens in the family and how to allow them to be better able to connect before it's too late. I will want to say a couple of things. I wanted to also, how many minutes do we have, Toby?
One. Don't worry, just go.
Okay, I will try to be very brief and sort of quickly cover a couple of things that I would like very much to touch, so please bear with me. As I said to you in the beginning, I think it's remarkable that you are here today because I think it's a topic that we all would prefer not to pay attention to and certainly not to dedicate a day to. The topic of atrocities is a difficult one to encounter. And in that context, and if we have to be very, very brief and to the point, I will say this. When encountering the victims of atrocities, you have to be well aware of the fact that we all have difficult feelings towards them, not just admiration and pity and compassion. We also have other feelings towards them because they represent something we don't want to see. They represent something we don't want to think is possible. They represent something we want to be sure cannot ever happen to us. And if we cannot find, we can then in that attempt we can try to deny it and say it didn't happen. Or we can say, oh, it happened to you, I can see why. Because you're unbelievably annoying, disgusting, upsetting. Yeah, I can see why. I'm a nice person, I'm only irritated with you. Somebody else could really want to kill you. It's not such a hard leap. Keep it in mind when you're meeting victims, that you might also, nice as you are, have some such reactions. And such reactions can sometimes simply be also reactions of disgust. You are disgusted by this person, or you reject this person for some reason that you don't, this is the patient you don't want to really come close to, things like that. All kinds of anger and blaming the victim and just wanting to not associate with that person and that patient. On the other hand, the other side of atrocity is our contemplation of the perpetrator, which is at least as disturbing, if not more disturbing. How could people come to be so cruel and sadistic? What made it possible for them to have no moral inhibitions? What made it possible to behave this way, to become so barbaric? What we would like to think is that we have nothing in common with such barbaric individuals. However, I would like to remind you that the majority of the elite, the figures in the elite Nazi leadership were actually highly educated professionals. They were not unlike ourselves in many ways. They were people, they were highly educated, they were not some barbaric, very, very different people from us. So I would like to say a couple of words about that because another book that, if you want, is of interest, a little bit perhaps outdated, but still a masterpiece, is The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton, dedicated 10 years of research, of interviews and with witnesses and with Nazi doctors themselves. And he came up with something that I hope you bear with me again. This is not an easy point to make, certainly not amongst our professional colleagues. But what he said was that the role, of course he was speaking about the role of physicians particularly in the Nazi killing machine, not just professionals, highly educated professionals, but really healers turned killers. And he said, he called it, the mechanism that allows it to happen, he called doubling, sort of the creation of another self that is parallel to the self that existed before, that has completely different moral